Now, it's been a long time since we thought much about nuclear weapons, but they are still there. Nuclear devices capable of killing millions of people sit on top of missiles in concrete bunkers and on submarines around the world. From one perspective, these weapons' frightening power has kept us safe from global war for 70 years. From another, they threaten our extinction and the destruction of the planet. And this week we learned that the British government plans to increase its number of warheads to 260 from an estimated 195. So is that a good idea? We can speak to Alan Mendoza, the Executive Director of the Foreign Affairs think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, and Rebecca Johnson, who is the Director of the acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Rebecca Johnson, do we need 260 nuclear warheads?
Well, actually, we don't need any nuclear warheads. If we really care about security in the 21st century, we need to be joining with all the UN member states that are trying to get rid of these profoundly dangerous and risky weapons. And we need to show ourselves as committed to a leadership position by continuing with the reductions that we began to undertake at the end of the Cold War and putting our skills, the skills at Aldermaston, for example, into the service of verifying nuclear disarmament treaties and putting the spotlight on the remaining countries that are trying to threaten the world with nuclear annihilation.
Alan?
Well, it's a wonderfully utopian view. And of course, if the world was filled with Western liberal democracies or even Eastern liberal democracies in this regard, it might be achievable. But the problem we face in today's strategic climate is that those states that Rebecca just mentioned are looking to increase their nuclear arsenals. There are new states clamoring, like Iran, to develop nuclear weapons. Those states don't wish us well. And were we to disarm effectively, then we will be at their mercy. They're not suddenly going to turn around and say, we're going to give up nuclear weapons because you've done. They'll go, brilliant. They've tied their hands behind their backs. We'll take advantage. And what the government, I think, is trying to do with this is to show that the strategic theatre has changed and we need to respond to that in order to ensure that we have deterrence. The key point is deterrence, of course, not use.
Rebecca, this idea then of kind of you blink first, it doesn't necessarily work.
Well, this is precisely the problem at the heart of nuclear deterrence. Nobody's saying that deterrence doesn't have a role to play in defense. The key issue is whether nuclear weapons have a sensible or effective role in deterrence. Chatham House, for example, has shown in a very important study how many times human and computer error, miscalculations, this you blink first, this crisis escalation has actually led the world since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963 to the potential to a near miss use of nuclear weapons, actually stopped very often by just one or two people who decided not to tell either the US or the Soviet governments of that time, the leaders of that time, that what they were picking up looked like a missile attack from the other side. Now, what we need for deterrence is a mixture of the kind of treaties that ban the weapons and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that just this January has finally entered into force. It's a UN treaty negotiated multilaterally. The UK chose not to participate in those negotiations, but the treaty has now entered into international legal force, and there's pressure from all over the world for countries to, with the current nuclear weapons, to take this way out of the nuclear sword of Damocles and to look at deterrence as in most countries in the world with far greater direct threats than the UK faces. They have deterrence through a mixture of diplomatic, political, economic, a whole range of tools in the deterrence toolbox that don't threaten the complete annihilation and extinction of life on Earth.
Okay, Alan Mendoza, this idea of catastrophic near misses, how much does that inform your view?
Well, there have been catastrophic near misses, but a couple. There have been, of course, discussions in the past when crises have occurred of people pulling back. What actually history shows you is it is, in fact, the awesome power of nuclear weapons, destructive power, that actually forces people to reconsider a decision that they might have made had it been conventional weapons, i.e. to invade a country or to launch an attack, and step back from that and say, actually, we're not going to do that. We're not going to believe it is a nuclear attack because we can't believe anyone will be that foolish. But what Rebecca fails to appreciate is that the entire history of the Cold War played out as it did because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. Had we not had that threat, the Soviets would have had nothing to stop them rolling across Western Europe because it would have been a conventional warfare, and with their greater reserves of manpower, this would have been a complete game. In fact, our whole posture during the Cold War to stop the Soviets coming from East Germany into West Germany was, if you step 1 foot from where you are now, that it will be deemed to be an attack against all of us, and we will respond. And the Soviets took that seriously. So actually, there's considerable proof that nuclear weapons stopped that from happening. Equally, by the way, with unstable regimes, Kim Jong-un, etc., in North Korea. What stops him from launching a nuclear attack, given we know he's fairly unstable, is the knowledge that his regime would be toppled overnight were that to happen.
Okay.
And that's a very powerful consideration.
Rebecca, if you could briefly just address the point that Alan has made and a few correspondents are making about the Cold War.
There's actually no evidence that it was nuclear weapons as opposed to a mix of other aspects. The fact is that the Soviet Union rolled over at the end of the Second World War after, it took over countries in Eastern Europe after the US had actually demonstrated that it had nuclear weapons in the use of those weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All the evidence suggests that there were, that quite contrary to what Alan is saying, nuclear weapons actually encourage reckless behavior by certain leaders. Tony Blair, for example, actually said in his memoir that knowing that the UK had nuclear weapons made him have the confidence, in a sense, to go into the attack with George Bush on Iraq, which actually led to a complete disintegration of Middle East security, for which we are very largely responsible. Reckless behavior often goes along when with leaders that think that their nuclear weapons will deter everybody else. What we need is to have a far greater role as the UK in the system of international norms and laws that bind the countries and put our expertise to try to stop those. You mentioned Iran. You've mentioned North Korea. North Korea specifically started pushing ahead to actually acquire nuclear weapons, pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty when George Bush named it with Iran and Iraq as axis of evil, and then attacked Iraq.
Okay.
Go figure.
Rebecca, thank you very much for that. Rebecca Johnson is the director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy. Before that, we heard from Alan Mendoza, who's the executive director of the foreign affairs think tank, the Henry Jackson Society.